In the text you learned about this thing called the switch task, where infants are shown a new object. This might be, as we've seen here, a picture on a tablet, but it could also be an actual object in their environment. But it's an object they've never seen before. And during the habituation phase, a voice over the loudspeaker repeats a word, lif, 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 as if to communicate that this object is called a lif. Later on in the experiment, there's a second phase called the test phase. And for some infants, they hear the same thing during the test phase. They hear, once more, the word lif, lif, repeated, while the same object is shown. But for half the infants, they undergo what's called a switch, where the same object is presented again, but instead of being called a lif, this time it's called neem, neem, neem. And when infants are exposed to this switch task, their response is pretty dramatic. They stare at the object and kind of act confused. Indeed, when we look at this graph, you can see the mean looking times during the test phase are moderate for lif. If they're seeing here the same word, they do look at it some more. They're interested in this object and hearing the word lif. But if you call it a neem, all of a sudden they're staring intently, like for many more seconds, at this object, wondering, why is it all of a sudden being called a neem? This is very confusing. Interestingly, there's another alternate kind of condition for this experiment, where the researcher might, instead of calling this a lif or a neem, they might use other words like bi and di. And under this condition, the same thing happens, where the researcher will present an object and they will call it bi, bi, bi. And then later on, for some of the infants, it will just be presented again and it will be called bi, bi again. But for some of the infants, half of them, it will be switched and they will see the same object and they will hear di, di, di. Infants undergo this fascinating ignorance under such a condition. You can see their mean looking times are approximately equivalent for whether it's bi or di. It doesn't matter what you call it the second time. If it's very similar, it's close enough for the infant. It's like they don't hear the difference between bi and di. It's like if you call this a di instead of a bi, they don't care. So, we ask ourselves, why are infants doing this? Why don't they care about the difference between bi and di? Are bi and di too similar to hear the difference? Well, we know this has to be untrue because we learned over the last couple of days that infants can hear very clear, minute differences. They can segment crazy differences in speech. They are able to hear just the most articulate of differences. They are not struggling to hear the difference between bi and di. So we wonder instead, are they ignoring the differences between those two words because they think it's irrelevant? And indeed, there's some evidence to suggest that this might be the case. Like, if babies have a very small vocabulary, as you read in your text, like just maybe a dozen words, baby, hat, yummy, spoon, mommy, shoe, milk, bottle, daddy, diaper, juice, blanket, if those are the only words they know, then learning a new word like bi, it's irrelevant. If you want to call it a di, fine, call it a di. The baby doesn't care. The difference between a B and a D doesn't make any difference because there is no word that's competing in their vocabulary for the other alternate version. If you called it a bi first, they know they've never heard this other word di. There's no reason to make a big deal out of calling it something slightly different. We also might wonder, is it hard to remember bi and di since they're new words? And indeed, we do find some evidence for this explanation as well. As adults are trying to learn new words, they struggle to make minute differences between similar sounding words too. Like if you try to teach adults the word blook versus the word kluk, and you're trying to have adults make a distinction between these two. If you switch the words on adults, they don't notice. They think it's close enough too. And that suggests that probably what's going on here is maybe if these words are new, then maybe it's hard for the baby to remember that it used to be called be instead of de. Indeed, if you use a familiar word like dog, and you all of a sudden start calling that dog a bog, oh, babies lose it. They're like, wait, why are you calling it a bog? So that means they can hear the difference between b and d. They can hear it, and they recognize that it's a meaningful difference if it's attached to a word they already are familiar with. So when they're learning new words, it might just be hard to pay attention or remember these differences. But we might also wonder, are the infants unsure that these sounds are even supposed to be words? And in a few days, you're going to do some additional reading that indicates, indeed, the infants in this paradigm are a little bit confused because there's an iPad there, and they hear some disembodied voice coming over a loudspeaker, just saying, nim, li, bi, noom, room, like these random words. And when they hear these disembodied words, they feel like, am I supposed to be paying attention to this? Like, is this word actually communicating to me? And so we'll learn in a few days that if you actually sit with an infant and you are the voice and you're clearly trying to communicate with the infant, you're pointing at something, you're talking about it, you're there in person, the infant is so much more likely to pick up on the differences between be and de. Instead of ignoring those differences, they start paying attention. If you call it in person, if you're sitting there with them and you call it be, and you're pointing at it and you're trying to teach them that it's a be, and 5 minutes later you start calling it a de, the baby is going to be freaking confused, right? They're like, whoa, why did you all of a sudden switch to de? So that shows, again, they can hear the differences, and sometimes they might even be able to remember the differences, but you have to be clearly communicating with them, teaching them, I'm trying to tell you this object is called something. And if you do that, then they're able to pick up on that.